So maybe we'll just start, and as people trickle in, they'll just kind of join. But we're just going to start with some introductions. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Sherin Nassar. I'm co-president of the Middle Eastern Law Student Association.
And I'm Ryen Bani-Hashemi, the other co-president, and we're very excited to have you all here. Before we get started, actually one thing I want to say is we know a lot of our members are Lebanese, or a lot of us also have a lot of family and friends in Lebanon, and we're all familiar with the news, the tragic news coming out of Lebanon. So we just want to know our thoughts are with you all, and if there's any suggestions of ways we can get involved in the coming days, please feel free to reach out to us. We really are looking for ways to help out in any way we can. So please reach out to Sherin and me, our email address, and I'll put it in the chat later on.
And yeah, we're super excited to have this event. Thank you to all of the MELSA members who are here today. And I know we have some allies in the room as well who are going to be participating and listening in. Ryen and I have been chatting about organizing an event like this for a while now. Obviously, everything that's going on with Black Lives Matter has us thinking about the ways we need to address and approach anti-Blackness, especially within the Middle Eastern community. And so we see this as a first initial step to begin those discussions. And now I want to turn it over to our speakers so that they can introduce themselves, and perhaps we'll start with Azadeh first.
Hi everyone, can you hear me fine? Okay, so my name is Azadeh. I'm Legal and Advocacy Director at Project South and past president of the National Lawyers Guild. And I guess there's going to be an opportunity later on in the program to talk more in depth about our work and the Black radical tradition that Project South, the work of Project South, is rooted in. But just very briefly, we're a social justice organization based in Atlanta, and we work with grassroots organizations and folks in support of movements for liberation. We also have comrades in the global south, including Palestine, Haiti, the Philippines, Iraq, and various parts of the global south that we work with.
And Sarah and Rana?
I could jump in next. My name is Rana, pronoun she, her. I'm the founder and president of Malikah, which is a grassroots nonprofit organization based out in Queens. And I can let Sada talk about Malikah a bit too, but we do gender justice programming and training rooted in trying to build a world where all women can be safe and all women can be powerful. I'm also on the board of Amnesty USA and have been doing racial justice and gender justice organizing work for almost a decade now.
Hi everyone, my name is Azadeh. I'm Sunni, and I have been working with Malikah, the grassroots movement, as Rana mentioned, to help market and provide empowering spaces for brown and Black women, as well as working with my local university and their global initiatives efforts.
Awesome. We're super excited to have you. I'm going to turn it over to Rana to start with a lead and demonstration to sort of engage the audience. And then from there, Ryen and I will be moderating questions. And then we will have time for questions at the end from the audience. We just ask you to save the questions for the end, and then we'll get to you guys.
Thanks, Sherin. So yeah, one of the things that Malikah does a lot is our work is rooted in a healing justice framework, which basically means that we ask our community to take a step back, to think about our positionality as something that's really essential to our ability to also organize and to affect change, both in our communities, also beyond our communities. And so positionality becomes really important. Our access to power and privilege becomes really important. So we actually have a couple of questions that we wanted to pose to the audience. We won't be able to actually have like a really in-depth conversation, but perhaps we could have maybe one or two people share. So I'll read out some of these questions. Actually, Stud, if you have them in front of you, if you want to read them out. Otherwise, I could.
Yeah, I can read them.
Okay.
These are 3 questions in total, and I'll read them as they are. So the first one is, how do you identify? And the next one is, how are you asked to identify by society? And the third one is, what do you identify with?
So each one of these questions, obviously identity is pretty broad, but we could I'm happy to personally model those answers to those three questions as maybe some of you begin to think about what your answers might be. For example, if I were to ask myself, how do I identify? I might identify as being from Queens, right? That's something that's really strong to my identity, coming from a working class immigrant background. How am I forced to identify? We could think about racially, how like in the US, North African, Middle Eastern category is categorized as white. And so on legal documents, I feel forced to identify with a racial category that I don't feel reflects my own identity. So I might have to put down white. And then what was the last one, Sada?
Okay, so the last one was, how are you asked to identify? And I added them to the chat.
Okay, cool. So yeah, wait, sorry. So I mixed that one. So the last one is the white one. And then the second one is, how do people identify you? I think most people, when they see me, the first thing they see is maybe my hijab. The first thing they see that I am a brown woman. And so they might identify me with whatever stereotypes they might have about Muslim women, about brown Muslim women, that typically might not reflect many parts of my own characterization and identity. So those are the three ways in which I might answer that.
Maybe someone from the audience could model as well. I think Amr was interested. Are you here, Amr?
Yes, hi. So in terms of, and thank you for putting it in the chat, Sarah, I appreciate it. I mean, I think that there are a number of ways in which I identify. I think, I'm Arab, I'm Egyptian, I'm a first generation American, I'm a member of diaspora, and everything that comes with that. I think in terms of how I'm asked to identify, I think that, there's simultaneously people they almost expect you to identify religiously, first and foremost, and in a very particular way of practicing and believing that, most of us are constantly confounded by. And then I also think that we're asked to identify in ways that assume that certain identities can't coexist with one another. And, obviously I see that as well with friends and with my sister, and, the experiences that my sister has, and some of the comments that are made to her are always, I mean, they're more than frustrating for me as her brother and as someone who, cares about her and cares about the community. And then I think that, for example, the census, right? Then there's like this one set of expectations that we're asked to identify with, and then there's also this other one where we're also asked to identify as white, which is just not true. And that's, I mean, I guess I answered the second and third questions a little bit in tandem, so I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for speaking into the space. We really appreciate it. And we urge all of you to really think through these questions, and think also about the hardest question that sometimes I'll ask people is like, what are some identities that you might not even think about, right? Because when we think about also from the perspective of privilege and our engagement with different power structures, the identities that we don't think about the most are typically the identities that give us the most privilege, right? And so when I think about, for example, all of you are affiliated with an academic institution, I never have to think about not being college educated, right? Because I have access to and have had access to very prestigious academic institutions. And so that's something that someone maybe who had not had access to a college education is something that they might think about regularly. And so we just wanted to start it off as we talk more about anti-Blackness, as we talk more about racism, how to be an active ally, to root it in these introspective questions of self, but oriented towards action always, right? So hopefully this line of questioning compels you to act in a way that feels more just, and it is more just in the world that we all exist in.
I see that, Majid, you have your hand up. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, sure. If I could just chime in on the questions, and I think one of the things Rana just mentioned sparked a thought in me. So I guess in a way, you know, maybe from the bottom, how am I asked to identify? Like my first, middle, and last name are very like Arabic Muslim presenting, so it like at least on paper that, you know, kind of creates an impression and perhaps a certain expectation of me. And then in terms of how people identify me, that gets very interesting, because what Rana just said made me think about this. At least the way I've going back over the years from like college to work to law school, at least my understanding is that the expectations from being like a South Asian male is actually like, it's actually a position of privilege, because in the workforce, in school, like I'm expected to do very well. Like it's just, it's a, in some ways a positive stereotype, but it's also a negative stereotype because it kind of excludes others who don't share my identity. And so I go back and forth on that, because, you know, I compare this to like, I have friends who are South Asian females, and, you know, you would assume the identities are similar except for the gender, but then they have to deal with all these other factors that I don't with. So they don't have that like expectation of always doing well, even though you would think, you know, similar background, similar everything, but the only differences are gender. So those are just some thoughts I had. Those are helpful.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that, and for having interrogated your own positionality before, obviously, which I'm sure many of you have. And some of it's uncomfortable, right, to sit with, and some of it's really nuanced. Like we don't all show up in the same way every day. Like I could really answer these questions differently, and I've done this exercise a million times, differently every single time. And so, thank you all for participating in this. I know Sherin probably wants us to get started with the panel segment.
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for participating, Amr and Majid. We really appreciate it, and we definitely encourage everyone to continue interrogating their identities in these ways. And I just want to stress what Rana said about their identities we don't even realize we really have, that carry a ton of privilege, especially because this is a Harvard Law event. We're at Harvard, and that carries a lot of privilege with it as well that people don't often get. So really great way to start. I'll start out with the first question, which is directed to any of the speakers. But as we begin to dive into this really relevant discussion, it'd be great to hear about the history of Middle Eastern communities specifically in perpetuating racism, especially anti-Blackness and within the US context, and any relevant historical context to help us sort of set the tone historically of where this community really is at.
I guess I kind of start with relatively more recent history. So I'm sure folks are familiar with the crackdown on, you know, Muslim, South Asian, Middle Eastern communities after 9/11. And so the tendency that I saw, and I was in law school at the time, and then, you know, started practicing shortly afterwards. So the tendency that I saw among many segments of the community was to, you know, again, try to get closer to structures of power, which tend to be white, and, you know, integrate and just kind of lay low and, you know, not want to stir trouble. And I just, you know, remember this exchange actually at a mosque in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I was doing a No and Defend Your Rights workshop. And, you know, one of the questions came up after the presentation by an immigrant man, I believe he was Arab, was, you know, why is this happening to us? You know, why is the government going after us? You know, we're good immigrants, you know, we're not troublemakers. And then a Black Muslim man member and attendee of the same masjid told him, like, you're not gonna gain anything by just like, laying low and not wanting to speak out. Look at us, look at our experience of oppression. And, we were able to, achieve some victories through the civil rights movement after decades and decades and decades of struggle. And so, this dynamic is something that I continue to see, in our work in terms of, generally, as in my experience, sort of, the mosques that are, Black-led tend to be more sort of, revolutionary, and I think that's, an experience that sort of, immigrant Muslim communities and Middle Eastern communities need to look up to. But I don't think we're there, partly because of, again, the tendency of the community to want to integrate and, be white, and also just, the deep sort of history of anti-Black racism, which hopefully Rana and Sarah can also address, and we can, speak to more in the other questions as well.
Yeah, and I'll hop in now to the question. So I think that the racism which is faced in the US, of course, stems from racism that's taking place in these Arab nations. And I think back to Arab slave trade and even modern day Libya and trans-Mediterranean slave trade, and how that's responsible for been responsible for transporting millions of people from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Middle East. I also think about the Khalifa system in the Middle East and how it's the sponsorship system, which brings the migrant workers to the region and ties them to a single employer. I think about the abuse that's faced and how these people are lured in by false promises of fair wage and time off, but they often see a different reality when they arrive. So I believe that the way in that that's perpetuated there definitely affects racism that's faced in the US and how these ideologies are carried on when people immigrate here and have these sort of same attitudes towards Black people.
Yeah, Sana, I really appreciate you bringing up the kafala system, and I want to also honor kind of what someone said earlier about what's going on in Lebanon. I think when we think about, so I'll talk about it from a historical perspective, and then I'll also just want to address this real quick, is obviously what's happening in Lebanon is so devastating, right? And it's so difficult to watch, and it's such a consequence of like histories of violence, corruption, right? An elitist power structure that is very oppressive to many different communities within Lebanon. But I think the kafala system is such an example of a manifestation of anti-Blackness that impacts a lot of Black African migrants, but also a lot of Asian migrants. There are 250,000 domestic workers in Lebanon right now, most of whom are impacted and who are tied to a kafala system, who we know will be disproportionately impacted by what's going on in Lebanon right now. So I think it's important for us to center that as well in conversation in this moment, while also honoring, obviously, the general impact that many Lebanese are being faced with because of the violence and damage by the explosion. So I'll actually address this question by first nuancing that when we talk about Middle East, we talk about North Africa. I don't think we all have the same equal responsibility, right? Like Middle East, North Africa, that's a very diverse region of the world. Many people are Black and from this part of the world. And so I think the responsibility in terms of the history of anti-Blackness falls mostly on, and who has perpetuated anti-Blackness falls on brown and white passing Arabs, Middle Eastern, North African people who oftentimes uphold systems in the region, as Sarah said, but also coming to the United States, also in the US. And people, we talk about the census, and I think it's really important, and y'all probably know, right, because you're all law school students, of different Supreme Court hearings that actually led to us being forced to identify as white. It was a white passing Syrian Christian who in 1915 argued for that white categorization. And because he had the phenotype, because of his religious identity, which gave him some level of privilege, was able to get this passed. And then we saw a Saudi student fight for the same thing in 1944. And so again, this like systemic fight to be categorized as white that then also now manifests in different ways, right? This assimilation and integration and aspiration to whiteness, which oftentimes comes at the cost and the expense of Black Americans, Black Arabs, Black North African folks, and Middle Eastern folks, is very damaging. And I think it's important for us, as we're kind of thinking about also now we want to diversify categorization, to acknowledge that there was a point politically where it was very beneficial, right? Like there were a lot of Arabs who had access to US immigration before 1965 because of that white categorization. And there are moments when a lot of Arabs do benefit from white privilege, still to this day, upholding anti-Black systems. And so I'll just leave us off with that.
Yeah.
Because I think the other two moderate speakers spoke really well on this as well.
Thank you everyone for that. I just wanted to chip in for a hot second and say also, even in terms of like modern day Arabic, right? A lot of people in the MENA region will refer to Black people with the word that means slave. And that's still like something that we need to unlearn in our vocabulary. I think some of the younger generation is aware of this, but a lot of the older generation don't even understand the historical roots of that word and how problematic it actually is in our speech. But thank you so much for that very detailed answers, all of you.
Yeah, actually, you both very much touched on an issue I wanted to bring up, which is something that's always kind of confused me a little bit, or that I always wanted to dig deeper into, is that Middle Eastern communities are a group of immigrants who are obviously very much impacted or familiar with state violence, both by the United States and their native governments. I've always wondered, why do you think Middle Eastern, North African community members still struggle to empathize or take action in response to state violence and oppression of Black Americans? And you've touched on this a little bit, for example, the white passing or trying not to stir up any tension or anything, but do you think class plays a role in this as well? What else do you think kind of gets in the way of any sort of action?
So I think class plays a huge role. Again, not wanting to generalize, but what I have seen in my personal experience, you have this tendency on the part of middle class and upper middle class folks to want to, again, integrate, be identified as white, good immigrants. And so, want to stay away from losing that status. Anything that could jeopardize that status is, no. But I mean, then at the same time, then you have groups such as DRUM, this is rising up and moving in New York, groups like AROC or AAAN in Chicago, that primarily organize working class folks from South Asian or Middle Eastern, North African backgrounds, and I think you see solidarity with Black folks a lot more among those groups. Partly because of the just working together with with Black folks, with Latinx folks, and so feeling that solidarity as opposed to probably employing Black or Latinx folks.
And jumping into that, I guess a question for all of you guys is, how do you think our community begins to, one, unlearn these issues, but also begin to confront and actively challenge the roots of this history, and also how not only us, but how our parents perpetuate the racism. And whether that's, in academic spaces, but also like masjids and mosques are a really good example of how that starts to play out as well. And then also within social systems and our own social groups.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different levels of engagement that need to take place, and there's different responsibilities for different people based off of kind of the access that we all have. in terms of engagement of parents and elders. There's a resource, actually, not to plug in a resource I built, but there is a resource I built in Arabic and in English, which is like 6 ways to confront anti-Blackness in the Arab community, that I urge people, and it's translated into Arabic, so that's something you can pass on to your family. I think for me, actually tying back to the other question, like my own personal experience in terms of trying to bridge the gap for my family is trying to frame it from a colonial perspective. Like I'm like, my mom knows everything about British colonization of Egypt, right? Like my mom knows so much about like the military industrial complex in Egypt, right? So let me explain to her how police violence is actually stems from a very similar system, right? How the way in which British treated and exploited Egyptian people as someone who comes from a farm and peasant background, is that's something that could be translated also in comprehension to the ways in which folks are treated, or Black people were treated in the United States, because these systems are so global, right? So for me, it's been trying to bring my family along for years, right, through slow education, which I think is like super important, and through conversation and just a lot of empathy, right? Like I think sometimes I've seen these conversations happen in a way that could be very flippant, and I think that does a disservice to the work that we're trying to do. Yeah.
Anyone else have any other? Oh, yes.
Oh, just a resource for the Iranian community is a great book by Neda Maghloubeh called The Limits of Whiteness that I encourage everybody to read. And yeah, I mean, it's very challenging. I mean, the roots of racism, anti-Black racism, and just, racism generally, I think are very deep, unfortunately, within Iranian communities, which is, community I'm particularly familiar with because I'm, Iranian. So I think just like being able to challenge and shut down racist conversations every opportunity that you get, it can be very exhausting, but if we don't do it in our own family spaces and social gatherings, who else is going to?
Thank you very much. I'm gonna have to second that plug for Dr. Maghloubeh's book, The Limits of Whiteness. It's a great read.
I think Ryan, really quick, I think Sara wanted to speak.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to add to what the other speakers were saying to the question, and that it's important that we stop like glossing over the history of slavery, and that I find it almost hypocritical that, like you mentioned, Sherin, the word abd is like constantly used and out of language, like very casually. But then people are too uncomfortable to discuss or teach the history of slavery, and that's something they'll often back away from. So calling out this casual racism is crucial, and I know that we've all seen this taking place on social media within the past few weeks and months, but social media can often be an echo chamber almost, because the many people that follow us like already believe these things that we believe. So I think it's most important to have these sort of conversations, like starting at home, like within your own 4 walls, at the dinner table with family members, because I guarantee that, our parents and uncles and aunts and even grandparents still carry these ideas and very casually do. And so it is our duty to call that out and inform them of things that they might not be seeing like we are.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't see that you unmuted. I'm still getting used to this new Zoom paradigm. Azadeh, just real quick, you mentioned briefly the organization you work for, Project South, but do you mind going into a little bit more detail? I understand your organization specifically has Black leadership, incorporates movement lawyering aspects to achieve more radical forms of transformation. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more detail about Project South and your work with the organization.
Sure. So as I mentioned, we are based in Atlanta, Georgia. We were founded in 1986. And so our framework and our work is rooted in the Black radical tradition. So I'm just going to go over some principles very quickly. So one is that directly impacted folks always lead the struggle. And the knowledge that we're in this struggle for the long haul. So we need to organize and build social justice movements. We have the traditions to look up to, the legacy of success because of organizing and grassroots movements, the knowledge that people should rely on internal resources as opposed to external factors, so nobody's gonna come save you. and just the internationalist tradition that Project South's work with our comrades in the Global South is based on. And so, you know, one thing that distinguishes our organization that has, you know, a legal arm from, you know, a lot of other sort of legal, you know, organizations, advocacy organizations out there is that I joined the organization in 2016 after 30 years that the organization had already been in existence as the first lawyer. So, you know, the organizing, the, you know, community-based education was very much established after they decided to hire a lawyer. And so it was, you know, very clear to me from the beginning that my role is to support the organizing as opposed to the other way around. And so the model of the lawyering that we're engaged in is movement lawyering, meaning that we take direction from serve and are accountable to the movement. And we're very clear that our role as lawyers and just, you know, legal workers or law students is not to direct a movement.
Another question, thank you so much for that. And I think it's really important to stress, especially as we're lawyers who are going to be entering the field and, you know, figuring out what our path is, that obviously if we move forward in this struggle specifically, like we are not the ones and should not be the only ones leading the struggle at all and deferring to the people who are actually immediately impacted. And movement lawyering is a great model for that as well. We also have seen growing concerns over police surveillance of protests, as well as communities of color being targeted through technologies that use, you know, different tools like facial recognition cameras. In the post 9/11 era, obviously the Arab community witnessed how police surveillance affected our community and specifically damaged our community and saw our mosques infiltrated. And it did result in a great number of incarcerations, people listed on the no-fly list, and singling out for government jobs. Do you fear, one, we've obviously seen similar consequences for the Black Lives Matter protests, but can you maybe shed some light on what allies of the movement can do to protect themselves? But more specifically, how has surveillance and the tradition of surveillance affected Black Lives Matter?
I'll go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, you go, Sara, please.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this sort of unlawful surveillance that lives in secrecy, it really does threaten activism and free speech. Also, just the political inquiry that is necessary for us to hold the government accountable for policies and actions. And I do see a correlation between surveillance that, you know, out of community space post 9/11 and Black communities in this manner. But yeah, I just wanted to plug that, like, there has been a lot of evidence of police and federal agents using counterterror resources and tactics to aggressively surveillance these protesters. And we've seen how people that are identified in like pictures and videos that have floated around online, how they've been facing or being kind of like targeted at later events, like within their homes even. So just to be even mindful of like what people are sharing online and ensuring that you're not putting anyone's life at risk is really important.
Yeah, thank you, Sara, and thank you, Sherin. So yeah, I mean, I'm actually from Queens. I'm from Steinway Street. So if anyone has heard of, you know, the surveillance that took place on Steinway, where there was NYPD officers literally in like hookah lounges, they had like taped like lounges. They had infiltrators in our mosques. My community was heavily impacted after 9/11, and that after 9/11, many fathers in my neighborhood were disappeared. People were living like in fear in a very like frightening way. And I just remember how much that disrupted the trust that was built. Like, we're such a tight-knit community, and like we like literally to this day people make jokes like, I think that person was an informant, you know, and like it's actually very serious. So I do think this like reality of surveillance is very scary, and I think it's worse in the sense that there is so much technology that can fuel it now, right? Like the advanced level of facial recognition technology, the ways in which different social platforms can be infiltrated, it makes it even harder for organizers to really think about what online safety could look like. There are incredible organizations that are out there as well, like Equality Labs. I think, hopefully I'm not saying their name wrong, does digital organizing training for organizers specifically on how they can make sure that they're safe online. Malikah has put out some information, especially for women, because there's a different way in which online violence and surveillance can take place for women as well. That is important to be mindful of. So I think continuing to prepare ourselves as activists and organizers by being equipped with the right tools, and then also challenging the development of these technologies at a policy level becomes very, very important, because we know historically how this disrupted and created challenges for movements in the past, both in the US and across the globe as well, like in the region as well. The technology is used for surveillance in a really extensive way.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add also just, the trend towards militarization of surveillance. So we know that the Pentagon is actually monitoring protests in at least 7 states, including Minnesota. And so I think, as legal activists in the movement, we have a responsibility to protect our folks. So an organization I am involved with, the National Lawyers Guild, now has a hotline number for folks to basically call and report instances of federal repression, including FBI door knocks, subpoenas, grand jury subpoenas, etc. So hopefully folks can get access to that hotline number. It's on the website, but also just, serving as legal observers. The NLG has a very established legal observer program. So the more you can, use your legal skills to, go ahead and, support the protest in whatever you can. I think that would be great.
All right, thank you all very much. This question is for Rana and Sara. I was wondering if you could, you already touched a little bit about the work Malikah does, but could you explain a little bit more in more detail about what your organization, what type of work you're engaged with, and also if you feel comfortable sharing any sort of, what drove you to get involved in this work or to start the organization in the first place, and if you mind a little bit about how the Middle Eastern community ourselves are unknowingly or unintentionally obstructing the type of organizing or the work that Malikah engages with.
Okay, I could start. Yeah, so Malikah was founded, I founded Malikah when I was young, when I was 16, 17. And the reason was because I experienced a hate-based attack. I was walking down the street in Queens, and I was assaulted by a man who tried to take off my hijab. And it was in this moment, which was like, it was like one of the first times in my life, even though before that moment, growing up post 9/11 in this working class community that experienced a lot of state-sanctioned violence by the NYPD and by New York City, it was the first time walking down the street and feeling really unsafe in my own skin, and I felt that for a really long time after, right? And I think a lot of people of color at the intersections of various identities have felt that in different ways. And I have a black belt in Shotokan karate, so started to train girls in my neighborhood in self-defense. It wasn't self-defense, I was calling it self-defense, but it was karate. And then afterwards we'd sit and we'd talk about our experiences. And Malikah basically has grown to this day to be a training-based movement organization where we provide training mostly for brown and black women in facilitation and anti-oppression and anti-racism, in gender justice, in healing, self-defense, and organizing. And then these women go back into their neighborhood, similar to the model that started Malikah, and actually facilitate programming to their communities. But we have an organizing frame in the sense that, like, we recognize that self-defense is not enough, right? Healing, we shouldn't have to heal from these traumas that our bodies experience. We should not have to experience these patriarchal, sexist, classist systems to begin with. And so organizing is a huge part of that. And then we also try to organize and have organizing trainings that have specific timelines and strategic outcomes that are very local. So it's like, how do I get 3 women on the board of the mosque, right? And how do I change who's on the bid in my local neighborhood because it's all like older white men, right? So it's hyper local work that I feel deeply passionate about. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to jump in. I feel like I'm kind of answering questions, but also speaking about Malikah and how much I love it, which is the truth.
Yeah, thank you, Rana, for highlighting that. So I just wanted to share my experience and kind of talk about what like brought me to this work. After meeting Rana and learning more about Malikah, I found it to be almost like my duty and just a really important part for me to take place in this organization, to continue learning from my sisters that I've now made here, and also to learn about ways that we can continue to mitigate risks so that less women across the globe experience violence, gender-based violence, racial violence. Also to continue to equip them with tools and resources that are really necessary in just navigating forward, navigating their lives and identities. And I myself am constantly learning from this. So it's been really nice to be part of the community.
Thank you very much. Actually, I just have one quick follow-up, specifically for those of us in the audience who would like to find ways to advocate for women of color, or specifically Muslim women. And Rana, you mentioned this very briefly about sort of how people essentialize your experience through stereotypes and things like that. So I was wondering, how can we get advocate and get organized in this role while avoiding this sort of trap?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And also, like, it's interesting because anti-Muslim violence is very much rooted in anti-Blackness also in the United States. If you think about who were enslaved people who were brought over, there's estimates that up to 30% of them were Black Muslims, Black African Muslims, some of whom were leaders, right? And so knowing that history, even one of the first kind of revolts against slavery that took place which happened in Brazil, which today is modern day Brazil, was a really highly esteemed imam, right? And the revolt happened on a Friday after a Friday prayer. And many of these Black Africans who were enslaved at the time were deeply rooted in their religion and faith, but were also forced to convert, right? And forced to not be able to practice their faith. And so I think remembering that history, knowing that history is really important as you do work around anti-racism and anti-Blackness in the US. But then there's also like globally, right? There's still a fight to this day in the Middle East and North Africa to allow for women to be able to be visibly wearing their hijab and in certain resorts, right? In Egypt, there's like a whole movement happening right now. There's a lot of discrimination that women, employment, discrimination that women who wear the hijab, even in these Muslim majority countries, still experience. And so knowing, being aware of that, speaking up against it, don't die in these places if you're going to the Middle East and North Africa that have these bans. And then showing up also against different policies that obviously that perpetuate violence against Muslim communities as a whole is deeply important as well, because it's that micro interaction, right? So like building relationships, building awareness, but also like how are we creating change at a macro level, at a systems level for Muslims against anti-Muslim violence globally.
Azadeh, this question is for you. Obviously, you work deeply in movement lawyering, and as you said, you are working with Project South. It would be really great to hear, in your experience working alongside grassroots movements, have you witnessed actual changes to how cities or states are approaching the criminal justice system? And alongside that, obviously, what are some of the social programs that our communities and other communities can invest in rather than pouring money within police departments and penal systems that obviously impact how anti-Blackness is perpetuated both socially but also on the judicial level?
Yeah. I should mention that a campaign we're currently working on, following the example of Durham, North Carolina, is to get Atlanta out of the police exchange program with Israel, because Atlanta is one of the many cities across the country that on an annual basis send their police to Israel for this exchange program in repression. So that's something that we're currently working on. But we also were successful in convincing the mayor of Atlanta to stop detaining immigrants at the Atlanta City Detention Center. You know, Atlanta holds itself out as progressive and welcoming at the same time as they were making millions of dollars of money off of detention of immigrants. And so, you know, we were part of this multi-year grassroots campaign to basically shut this down. And so we were, you know, successful in that. So that happened in fall of 2018. But then we didn't stop there. We're part of this coalition led by formerly incarcerated Black women and trans folks that aims to shut down the city jail altogether. And instead, you know, substitute a community center. So that is something that we're working on, and you know, hopefully can achieve that goal. But also in terms of, you know, where resources need to go, you know, instead of reform, you know, we're done with reform. You cannot reform the police. You know, the police needs to be abolished. I mean, just, you know, look at the Minneapolis Police Department and how much resource went into that police department, and, you know, then what happened, you know, the murders since. So, you know, abolition is something that we're working towards. So to the extent that folks can invest resources in abolitionist organizations, but also just look locally, investing in local grassroots organizations that are leading you know, some of these fights for abolition, especially movements led by Black folks, and also you know, organizations led by Black folks and businesses. You know, Black led and Black owned businesses are you know, very much always in needs of community support, not just at this moment.
I just want to echo really quickly that, like Azadeh said, we're done with reform. And if anyone's not on that train, happy to talk online, like abolition all the way. But just really want to stress that reform is, for me, and I think for a lot of others, is out. So let's chat about that.
Yeah, actually, we're definitely open to this dialogue. So please, you know how to reach us once again. So we're happy to chat. And that concludes our questions for everyone. I would love to open this up for the audience. If anyone has any questions, please just raise your hand and give a little introduction. Say your name, if you're in at HLS, what year you are. And yeah, thank you very much. All right, thank you, Ata. You're up.
Thank you very much. Thank you for our panelists. This has been a great event. Thank you to everybody who joined. I am a rising 2L at HLS. I'm also in MELSA. I serve as the outreach director. And I had a couple questions, but the first question I wanted to ask to all of our panelists was, I think all of the people who are on this talk, most of us have been attending protests. We've been talking to our parents or families or friends, have been kind of engaging our representatives, and we're kind of thinking about ways to defund the police, return some of that funding to our communities. And I was wondering at this moment, and especially after some of the social media has died out and we're working on reform, working on ways to move forward, what are your suggestions on kind of keeping the progress going and building that kind of deliberate ways forward from where we are currently?
I guess I can start, you know, join if you're not already part of a local campaign to shut down a prison. And I would also say, you know, let's not forget about immigration detention centers. You know, just today we heard the really tragic news about 2 more immigrants dying at 2 different immigration detention centers, one in Florida, one in Virginia. You know, obviously a lot of people detained at these horrible prisons are Black and brown folks. And so, you know, that also shutting down immigration detention centers also need to be part of the platform. So to the extent that, you know, you as law students could lend your legal research skills, but also just your presence as legal observers or otherwise to the fight locally, I think that's always important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think supporting institutions and organizations that are not part of the hype, right? So like organizations, even though the hype is cute too, because it like involves other people that are going to sustain your activism long term. And I would agree that like legal advice, legal perspective is so important. Like even for the work that Malikah is doing from a gendered perspective, right? Like having any legal perspective on different cases that we work with for specific women that we're working with is super helpful. So trying to identify like what skills specifically you could offer, given your academic background, given your experience, and then plugging in locally to local efforts. I would say though, as you're plugging in locally, again, that question on positionality is really important. Honoring the fact that people have been doing this work for years, and then also will probably continue this work for years, many of these organizers uncompensated for their labor. And so just as you're entering those spaces, thinking about how you're showing up and being intentional about how you show up in those spaces.
Yeah, and something I'll add to that also is, along with continuing to call out racism and bigotry within our own homes, things like organizing more group talks similar to this one to discuss race and social injustices, also the roles that privilege play in the fight for racial justice is really crucial. And also even partnering with diversity and inclusion offices or coordinators at your institution or organizations. And most of all, I think approaching this work not as you're saving or helping people, but to understand that it is a collective liberation movement that we all play a role in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for speaking. Are there any other questions? Feel free to just raise your hand if so.
I think you're on mute, Avisha.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and thanks for all of your insights. I was wondering if you have any tips on how to like keep the momentum and also be able to engage with activism at a time when during the pandemic it's really hard to be involved in communities and to stay engaged beyond online forms of activism. And given that it's unclear how long this will last, and given that we just went through a very momentous time in terms of anti-Blackness activism, do you have any tips for how we can stay engaged at this time during this year and also the next year and for however long this goes on?
I guess I can start. So one thing you can do, again, I talked about supporting sort of local organizations, grassroots organizations, supporting mutual aid efforts. So Project South, for example, and our partner organization, the Georgia Citizens Coalition Against Hunger, actually declared our building a mutual aid liberation center a couple of years ago. And the concept obviously being that we don't want to rely on the state for supporting our community. Definitely don't want to call the cops. We want to rely on each other. And so we have a community garden in the back. When COVID hit, Project South and partner organizations have started a testing program for the community, primarily Black communities in South Atlanta. Also, delivering whatever supplies the community, needed. So that's, one thing that you can try to support in your local community. And then also, again, putting a plug for the National Lawyers Guild. I think it's a great time for law students to get involved with the National Lawyers Guild, to just be able to use your legal skills in a way that's really going to help and support the movement and the protest. And the convention actually this year is virtual, which is going to be interesting. And for folks interested in abolition, the opening panel is going to be actually focused on prison abolition. So so that also might be a way for you to stay plugged in and to just kind of share your experience, but also just learn about what other folks are doing across the country.
Absolutely, and I agree with that. Supporting local grassroots movements is highly important. And I wanted to plug that I actually did work with Malikah to create a toolkit centered around digital organizing, since the work of a lot of organizers has been looking different due to quarantine rules. And this toolkit is it has resources and just digital tools that people can use to continue supporting the movement and adding this work. So if you reach out to Malikah, I'm sure we'd be happy to share that toolkit with you all.
Yeah, and Sarah, if you want to drop it in the chat as well, I know you've been dropping some resources, feel free. Rana, did you want to say something? I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in real quick for this question. I agree with everything that everyone's saying, and just remembering that it's like, it's not a sprint, right? It's a marathon. I feel like everyone's saying that, and that marathon has different phases in your activism. Like, there are moments in my activism where I'm like, this is my phase where I'm reading and educating myself, right? This is my phase where I'm going to be grassroots and out in the street. Like, I live with my family, so there were times where I can't be out, right, and helping with mutual aid stuff. So this is my phase where I'm doing phone calls for mutual aid and like trying to get people to like donate money. And so being empathetic with yourself and trying to identify what makes sense for you and where is most effective and strategic for you to plug into your energy is really important. And being reflective about your organizing is really important. I also want to plug in, if anyone's feeling like burnout, if is feeling, overwhelmed by the current reality, right, of the world, which is like really real, and that's impacting your organizing, impacting your ability to like feel like you're actualizing change. We also do weekly healing justice spaces, which folks are welcome to, and it's on our Instagram, so feel free to check it out. They're thematic, and so you could also reflect in that space as well.
Thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate we're running close on time. I just wanted to, before we end, just end with a poem by Lucille Clifton, who's a Black poet. And I'm just going to read a couple of words really quickly. It's her poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me? And it says, won't you celebrate with me what I've shaped into a kind of life I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight, my other hand, come celebrate. With me that every day, something that has tried to kill me and has failed. So I just want to thank our speakers. We really appreciate you doing this with us, and we are so excited that all our members could join us as well as allies in the room. And we really just also want to stress that this is only the bare minimum of the work that our community has to do. This is a great introductory step if you felt like you haven't been doing much. And we are devising ways, Ryan and I, about how we can continue this throughout the year. And if you guys have any suggestions about what you want to see or want any help, just reach out to us.
And thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you to all the audience members, everyone who asked questions or participated. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, Azadeh, Sarah, and Rana.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.